Today we're diving into the life and times of Laura Cornelius Kellogg.
Oh, an intriguing choice.
Yeah, she's someone who really embodies the word complex,
For sure.
especially when you start looking at the way people described her.
Right.
Princess Winterjean, the Indian Joan of Arc. They even called her a cyclone.
It's interesting how those nicknames, while meant as compliments, kind of show the struggles
Yeah.
and the prejudices someone like Kellogg faced back then.
Especially back then, early 20th century.
Exactly.
As if being an indigenous woman fighting for her people wasn't tough enough already.
And she didn't exactly shy away from the spotlight either.
No, she didn't.
Her upbringing, for an Oneida woman of that era, was unusual to say the least.
Definitely.
Grafton Hall, a private finishing school.
What an experience for a young Oneida woman.
Can you imagine the impact? Surrounded by privilege, instilled with a very specific view of success.
And yet always carrying her identity as an Oneida woman.
Exactly. So it's no wonder she developed such a strong voice.
A drive to challenge the way things were.
Absolutely.
And part of that drive, that fire, came from her family, right?
It's essential to understanding her motivations, for sure.
Because we can't just talk about Laura Cornelius Kellogg without talking about
Her grandfather, Chief Daniel Bread,
a powerful figure,
a leader who fought tirelessly for the Oneida people.
especially after their forced removal from New York.
That legacy of leadership, that responsibility to her people, it was ingrained in her very being.
So we have this fascinating mix: Oneida heritage, a privileged education.
And the weight of her ancestors' struggles on her shoulders.
And then she sets off on these European adventures. What was she seeking across the Atlantic?
This wasn't just a pleasure trip.
No.
She was on a quest
For
for ideas and inspiration. Kellogg immersed herself in the intellectual circles of Europe,
She was particularly drawn to one movement, if I remember correctly.
the Garden City movement.
Now, for those who might not be familiar,
Picture self-sufficient communities, green spaces, cooperation, community ownership.
sounds idyllic, almost utopian.
It was a powerful idea at the time. And for Kellogg, she saw in this model a way forward.
A way forward for indigenous communities.
Exactly. A way for them to thrive economically,
To govern themselves.
free from the assimilationist policies being forced on them.
It's fascinating how she found inspiration for Native American progress in a movement so tied to European ideals.
Remember, this is a time when the U.S. government was actively trying to dismantle tribal sovereignty.
To assimilate Native Americans into mainstream society.
Precisely. And Kellogg saw the potential for something different with Garden Cities.
A way to preserve their traditions while embracing a modern approach to development.
Exactly.
A bold vision, for sure.
It was.
And she didn't stop at just dreaming. She took action,
She did.
becoming a founding member of the Society of American Indians.
A pivotal moment for her.
A chance to put those ideas into practice on a larger scale.
Indeed.
But before we get into that, can you tell us more about the society itself?
The Society of American Indians was at the forefront of what was then called Pan-Indianism,
Meaning?
the idea of uniting diverse Native American tribes under a common banner.
To fight for their rights together? That must have been a Herculean task, getting everyone on the same page.
It really was. Imagine tribes with different histories, priorities,
Trying to find common ground.
and facing immense pressure from the government.
So how was this Pan-Indianism idea received?
A mixture of hope and skepticism, really. Some saw it as a powerful tool,
To combat oppression.
yes, while others worried about losing their tribal sovereignty in the process.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So where did Kellogg stand? Was she seen as a unifying force within the society?
She was, how shall we say, a complex figure.
Meaning?
Well, she certainly generated strong reactions wherever she went.
We did call her a cyclone earlier.
Right. Some, like Reverend Sherman Coolidge, a Lakota activist, saw her as brilliant.
A powerful advocate for change.
Yes. But others,
Yeah.
they were wary.
Where ya?
Her ambition, her tendency to maybe sometimes dominate the conversation.
Not everyone was on board with her approach.
Not exactly.
Mm.
Yeah, visionary full of schemes, to quote Charles Dagonet.
He was a member of the society himself, wasn't he?
A prominent lawyer, actually,
Yeah.
admired her passion.
But not so much the execution.
Or perhaps her pragmatism.
Well, right, turning those grand visions into reality.
Exactly. Though I think cyclone is probably the most telling comparison,
Ah, yes, the infamous cyclone comment.
courtesy of Carlos Montezuma,
A Yavapai physician and activist.
who, like Dagonet, acknowledged her dedication.
But maybe found her approach a little too Forceful.
Let's just say she knew how to make an entrance.
And an exit, probably,
Which
yeah.
brings us, rather fittingly, to her most ambitious project yet.
The Lolomi Plan.
Named, if you'll recall, after a traditional Oneida game.
One that requires strategy, collaboration, very appropriate.
Kellogg aimed to create self-sufficient communities on reservations.
Blending traditional knowledge with modern practices.
Imagine local industries, each tailored to a community's strengths.
Working together towards economic independence.
Precisely.
A true fusion of her Oneida heritage and those European ideals.
She had a knack for weaving those together.
Did she manage to get any support for this plan?
Initially, yes. She caught the eye of several wealthy philanthropists.
Drawn to her passion, I imagine.
And the potential of the Lolomi Plan. Turning those initial investments into lasting success, however.
That proved to be the real challenge.
As it often is.
So let's look at her attempts to put this plan into action.
Starting with?
The Oneida boarding school in Wisconsin.
Ah, the Cherry Garden City.
What was she hoping to achieve there?
Imagine this symbol of assimilation. A place where Native American children were sent to shed their culture.
Transformed into a beacon of self-sufficiency.
With its own schools, industries, even a cannery.
Capitalizing on all those cherry orchards.
Exactly, turning oppression into empowerment.
A powerful image.
One she fought tirelessly for.
But it faced roadblocks.
Funding, primarily. For years, she sought out loans, investments.
From 1919 to 1924, if I remember correctly.
And while there was initial support, disagreements arose.
Within the Oneida community.
Sadly, yes. Some questioned her leadership, her financial management.
The age-old problem of internal divisions.
And in the end, she simply couldn't secure the funds needed to purchase the property.
So the Cherry Garden City never blossomed.
The Bureau of Indian Affairs ultimately sold the property to the Catholic Diocese of Green Bay.
A heartbreaking blow, I'm sure.
It was.
But Kellogg, ever resilient, had another project in the works at the same time.
She did.
This one with the Kituwa Nighthawk Society in Oklahoma.
Now, the Kituwa, they were known for their fierce independence.
And their adherence to tradition.
Which is what makes her involvement so interesting. They'd resisted assimilation, kept their ceremonies hidden.
It seems almost counterintuitive that they'd welcome someone like Kellogg.
She had a way of bridging divides, of connecting with people on a deeper level.
So how did she win them over?
By understanding their desire for self-sufficiency, their mistrust of outside interference.
She tailored her pitch, emphasizing those aspects of the Lolomi Plan.
Framing it as a way to preserve their traditions while navigating the modern world.
And they embraced her vision.
They even gave her a Cherokee name. Yigat Ahain.
Which means?
Dawn. A new beginning, a sense of hope.
So, with their trust, how did the Lolomi Plan take shape in Oklahoma?
They focused on cattle ranching, even purchasing a herd from the Oneida stock farm in Wisconsin.
The nice touch.
They established a bank, aiming to create a financial institution for Native Americans.
Controlled by Native Americans.
Of course. And central to the plan was the creation of a self-sustaining community.
Families relocating to live and work together.
Precisely. A bold experiment.
That I'm sensing didn't quite go to plan.
The 1920s were a turbulent time, economically speaking.
The Roaring Twenties weren't so roaring for everyone.
No. The bank failed, hit hard by the downturn.
And the cattle.
Seized by creditors, I'm afraid. Many Kituwa families who'd invested in the plan lost everything.
A devastating blow for all involved.
It was a harsh lesson in the realities of the market, and one that tarnished Kellogg's reputation.
Understandably so, though it's hard to pin the blame solely on her.
True. But the fact remained. She'd promised prosperity, and instead there was hardship.
Leaving her reputation in tatters.
And yet, she wasn't finished. Kellogg had one more ambitious fight left in her.
And this time, it revolved around land claims.
Billions of dollars and millions of acres at stake.
A story for another time, perhaps. We're back, and yeah, things are about to get interesting.
High stakes, for sure.
Land, legacy, billions of dollars on the line. It's quite a chapter.
It really speaks to the ongoing fight for indigenous land rights.
Which continues to this day.
Sadly, yes.
So set the scene for us.
Okay.
What exactly was Kellogg fighting for this time?
Her focus shifted to reclaiming land for the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy.
Land that had been, what, illegally seized?
Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, yes. Her argument was that these land cessions violated treaties.
Treaties the U.S. government had signed with sovereign indigenous nations.
Exactly. It wasn't just about righting past wrongs. It was about upholding established agreements.
Sounds like a solid case. Were there early victories?
There were a couple of promising developments in the early 1920s.
Such as?
Well, there was the Boylan case.
That name rings a bell.
It was a landmark decision.
In what way?
It affirmed the federal government's responsibility to protect indigenous lands from state encroachment.
So a win for tribal sovereignty.
Essentially, yes.
Did Kellogg use that momentum to her advantage?
Absolutely, she saw it as a precedent.
One she could leverage for the Six Nations claims.
And then there was the Everett Report in 1926.
Ah, that's what I was remembering.
This report, commissioned by New York State itself,
Okay, so pretty official.
concluded that the Six Nations were entitled to 6 million acres of land.
6 million? That's huge.
Yeah.
What's that, almost the size of Vermont?
It sent shockwaves through the political establishment
As you can imagine.
because you're talking about prime real estate, resources,
A lot of powerful people did not want to see that land returned.
to say the least.
But for Kellogg and her supporters, this must have felt like a turning point.
It was a moment of immense hope.
They had the law on their side, public opinion.
And Kellogg, she seized on that momentum.
How so?
Fundraising rallies, speeches. She even took her campaign international.
Really?
To Canada, yes. She understood this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a social movement.
And she knew how to rally people to her cause.
She was a force of nature when she was in her element.
And there's always a but, right?
Right.
Such a large movement with so much at stake.
It's bound to attract its share of controversy.
And internal strife.
Sadly, yes. Even within the Six Nations, divisions emerged.
Really? Over what?
Some leaders questioned her financial management, others saw her as an outsider.
An outsider. But she was Oneida herself.
True. But her methods, her education?
They saw her as too assimilated.
Perhaps. Or maybe they simply didn't trust her to navigate such a delicate situation.
A good reminder that even with a common goal,
Unity can be fragile.
and those divisions, they often undermine the cause itself.
They create weaknesses that those in power are all too eager to exploit.
So what happened? Did those cracks start to show?
Unfortunately, yes. Kellogg faced setbacks in court. Funding dried up.
Any specific turning points?
She lost a crucial battle for control of Onondaga Nation funds.
Which she was hoping to use for the land claims.
Exactly. And then Edward Everett,
The author of that book.
he passed away unexpectedly in 1928.
A blow to her credibility, I imagine.
A significant one. But the final blow came in 1929.
What happened?
A judge ruled in favor of a rival faction within the Six Nations.
So not only did she lose the case,
She lost her authority to even represent the Confederacy in these matters.
years of work, undone.
Just like that.
It's tragic. She poured her heart and soul into this fight, only to be sidelined at the 11th hour.
A cautionary tale, perhaps.
About the importance of unity.
And the limits of individual action, even with the best of intentions.
Kellogg's story didn't end in 29, though, did it?
No, she lived until 1947.
What happened during those final years?
She continued to advocate for indigenous rights.
But never regained her former prominence.
Sadly, no. And she faced financial hardship.
It's a poignant end to a life filled with such passion.
And ultimately, tragedy.
So where does that leave us? What can we learn from Laura Cornelius Kellogg?
Her story reminds us that history is messy,
Rarely black and white.
full of contradictions and complexities.
And that sometimes even our heroes.
Have flaws.
But that doesn't diminish their impact.
Not at all. Kellogg, she was a visionary, a fighter who dared to challenge the status quo.
And while she might not have achieved all her goals,
Her legacy lives on.
in the ongoing struggle for Indigenous rights.
And in the stories we tell about those who fight for justice.
Exactly. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listeners have learned a thing or two today.
Me too, it's been a pleasure.
As always, and to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating figure from history. Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the spirit of curiosity alive.